Helmand Province, southern Afghanistan. 3 in the morning, on the 14th of July 2009. The temperature has dropped to 4 degrees Celsius, which means nothing until you understand that 12 hours ago it was 47. The desert does not cool down, it collapses. The heat falls out of the air like something dying, and what replaces it is not comfort but a different kind of hostility, sharp and thin and dark in a way that cities never are. This is not darkness you can push back with a torch. It fills the spaces between rocks, pools, and the dry riverbeds called wadis, and sits over the mud compounds of Sangin district, like something alive and waiting. The air tastes of dust and dried animal dung and the faint chemical sweetness of poppy residue that has soaked into the earth of this valley for generations. The mountains to the north are invisible. You know they are there because the stars stop at a certain point, blotted out by something vast and cold and indifferent. The ground underfoot is not ground in any familiar sense. It is fractured shale and packed earth, loose stone that shifts without warning, irrigation ditches that open up in the dark like wounds. To walk through this terrain in daylight requires concentration. To operate through it at speed, in silence, in full combat gear, at night, is something that defies civilian vocabulary. In the compounds below the ridgeline, something was sleeping that would not sleep much longer. And in the weeks that followed this night, 2 words would begin circulating through Taliban radio communications, through courier networks, through the whispered conversations of fighters in safe houses from Sangin to Kandahar. 2 words that no Western journalist would report for years. 2 words that the Ministry of Defense would neither confirm nor deny, because confirming them would mean explaining why those words existed. What those words revealed about the gap between 2 entirely different ways of fighting a war was something the institution had no appetite to discuss. The words were Shaitan Arba, night devils. This is the story they did not want told. To understand why a group of men operating in the dark of Helmand Province in 2009 would inspire that level of dread, you first need to understand what was happening above ground, in the sunlight, where the official version of the war was being conducted. In the summer of 2006, the British Army deployed the 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, into Helmand Province under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Tootle, then 41 years old, a decorated officer with service in the Balkans and Northern Ireland, a man who understood counterinsurgency well enough to know that what he was being asked to do with the resources he had been given was, in his own documented words, close to impossible. Tootle's battle group of approximately 3,000 personnel was tasked with pacifying a province the size of Scotland. His logistics chain was underfunded, his helicopter support was chronically insufficient, and the rules of engagement under which he operated were written by people who had never spent a night in a Helmand Wadi. The Ministry of Defense had promised Parliament that British forces would complete their tour without a single shot fired. The Secretary of State for Defense, John Reid, said those words publicly. He said them with the calm authority of someone who had studied maps rather than terrain. His exact words, delivered to the House of Commons on the 26th of January 2006, were that he would be happy if British forces left Afghanistan without firing a single bullet. Words that later became a kind of institutional shorthand for everything that went wrong in the years that followed. Because within weeks of deployment, Tootle's paratroopers were fighting for their lives in district centres across Helmand, outnumbered, undersupplied, and engaged in some of the most intense close-quarters combat British forces had seen since Korea. In 2006 alone, the British Army lost 49 soldiers in Afghanistan. In 2007, the number was 42. In 2008, it was 51. The public funerals through the Wiltshire market town of Wootton Bassett became a kind of national ritual of grief that nobody in government had planned for because nobody had expected the war to look like this. The conventional forces were fighting hard. That is not in question. The soldiers of the Parachute Regiment and the Royal Marines and the various battle groups that rotated through Helmand were brave and professional, and they were dying in numbers that the Ministry of Defence's original planning scenarios had not anticipated. They were operating with body armor weighing 25 kilograms, carrying rifles and ammunition and water and communications equipment that brought their fighting load to between 40 and 60 kilograms. They were patrolling by day through terrain that the Taliban had prepared over years. They were responding to contacts initiated by an enemy that chose the time, the place, and the terms of engagement. And somewhere else entirely, in a different part of the same war, a different group of British soldiers was operating in a way that almost nobody was authorized to discuss. Task Force Night. That was the official designation, though it was not used officially in any public document until years after the deployments it described had ended. It was the classified umbrella under which the British Special Air Service, the 22nd Regiment, operated in Afghanistan, alongside American units including Delta Force and the Intelligence Support Activity. Their base was a compound at Bagram Airfield that other British military personnel were not permitted to enter. Their aircraft, frequently modified Chinook helicopters with advanced terrain-following radar and infrared suppression systems, did not appear on the joint British Air tasking orders. Their operations did not feature in the daily intelligence summaries distributed to conventional British commanders. They were, in the most literal institutional sense, invisible. Major General Andrew Mackay, who commanded British forces in Afghanistan in 2007 and 2008, and who holds a doctorate in war studies and brings to military analysis a precision that makes most institutional assessments look like press releases, described the Special Air Service's operational tempo in Helmand during this period in terms that bear repeating carefully. He said that the regiment was conducting operations that bore no resemblance to anything the conventional British Army was doing. He said this not as criticism, but as simple categorization. 2 different institutions, 2 different wars. And then he said, in an after-action briefing later summarized in the Ministry of Defense's own classified review of Operation Herrick, the conventional force and the special forces were operating in the same physical space, but in entirely different dimensions of that space. He did not mean this metaphorically. The operation that broke into open daylight began at approximately 1400 hours on the 8th of August 2009, when a convoy of vehicles from the 1st Battalion, the Welsh Guards, departed forward operating base Shaukat in the Babaji area of central Helmand. The convoy comprised 4 Mastiff armored vehicles and 2 Viking tracked carriers, carrying 20 soldiers under the command of Lieutenant Richard Seal, 24 years old, commissioned from Sandhurst 18 months earlier, a Welshman from Abergavenny, who by every account from those who served with him was a capable and courageous officer doing a job that the machinery above him was making structurally impossible. The mission was a route clearance patrol, intended to push into a Taliban-controlled area north of the Nar-e-Bugra Canal and demonstrate British presence ahead of a district council meeting planned for the following week. The patrol had been briefed from intelligence assessments that described the route as medium threat. That intelligence assessment was wrong, and the people who wrote it had reasons for describing it the way they did that had more to do with maintaining the tempo of planned operations than with the actual disposition of Taliban forces on that specific route on that specific day. At approximately 15 hours, the lead Mastiff crossed a culvert over an irrigation ditch 2.3 kilometers north of the canal. What happened next took 47 seconds. The improvised explosive device beneath the culvert, later assessed by Royal Engineers to contain between 30 and 40 kilograms of homemade explosive packed into 2 yellow jerry cans, detonated with a pressure of approximately 26 pounds per square inch, sufficient to lift a vehicle weighing 24 tons several feet into the air, and then set it down on its side in a manner that bore no relationship to its original orientation. The concussion wave hit the second vehicle before its occupants understood what had happened. 2 soldiers were killed instantly. 3 were critically injured. The communication systems on the lead vehicle were destroyed. The crew of the second vehicle, trained, experienced, and brave, found themselves managing catastrophic casualties in a kill zone with no overhead cover and no clear communications to their base, while a Taliban element that had pre-positioned in the tree line 200 meters to the west began firing. The engagement lasted 22 minutes before reinforcements arrived by vehicle. It lasted long enough for the patrol to request emergency medevac 3 separate times, each transmission broken up by terrain masking and the interference patterns that the Taliban had learned to generate by operating simple jamming devices purchased from commercial sources for less than $400 each. 2 men died that day. Their names were Corporal Dane Elson, 22 years old, from Bridgend, and Private Jason Rawstron, 23 years old, from Bury. They were not the first. They would not be the last. And the manner of their deaths, and the specific intelligence failure that placed their patrol on that route on that day, became the subject of an internal army inquiry whose findings were classified at the time of writing and remained so. While the Welsh Guards were fighting in Babaji, and while their casualties were being processed through the field hospital at Camp Bastion, and while the Ministry of Defence's media operations team was drafting the press release that would describe 2 soldiers killed in action in Helmand Province without specifying the circumstances that placed them there, something entirely different was happening in the pre-dawn hours across the province. The intelligence had come through the day before. A network facilitator, a man responsible for coordinating the financial flows that kept Taliban operations in central Helmand functioning, was located in a compound in Nad-e-Ali district, 8 kilometers southwest of Lashkar. He had been assessed as high priority for 63 days. His compound had been watched by surveillance assets for 11 of those days. The pattern of life analysis had been completed. The target deck had been approved. The lawyers had reviewed the proportionality assessment. The squadron was already moving by the time most of the conventional force was finishing its evening meal. The men who comprised this assault element were not young. The average age in a Special Air Service Sabre squadron in 2009 was 31. The youngest operator on this particular operation was 28. Several were in their late 30s. One, a staff sergeant who would be referred to in subsequent briefings only by his initials, was 41 years old, had served in Bosnia, Sierra Leone, Iraq 3 times, and Afghanistan 4 times. He was, by the standards of any sporting or athletic organization, past his physical peak. By the standards of the Special Air Service selection and continuation training regime, he was experienced in a way that no amount of youth or physical fitness could substitute. Consider what it takes to reach that point. The Special Air Service selection process draws from across the British Army and the Royal Marines. Approximately 160 to 200 candidates attempt selection in each intake. The initial fitness phase, conducted in the Brecon Beacons and later the Black Mountains, involves carrying loads of 25 kilograms across distances of up to 64 kilometers in under 20 hours in Welsh winter conditions, with no navigational assistance, no team support, and no communication. The pass rate for the initial selection phases is approximately 10 to 15%. Those who pass then proceed to a further 6 months of continuation training covering demolitions, combat medicine, advanced signaling, language skills, escape and evasion, and resistance to interrogation. Of the original 200 who begin the process, fewer than 15 will typically complete it. In civilian terms, imagine applying for a professional position where 4 out of every 5 candidates are eliminated in the first week, and the final selection requires you to carry the equivalent of 2 large suitcases across terrain resembling the Scottish Highlands at the speed of a fast hiking pace, in darkness, alone in January, without a map that shows you where the finish line is, because the finish line moves. That is entry level. That is before a single day of operational deployment. The staff sergeant with the initials had passed selection in 1992. He had spent 17 years refining the skills that selection had identified as being present in embryonic form. He spoke functional Pashto. He could maintain a 4-person room clearance in complete darkness using infrared laser aiming devices and the instinctive spatial awareness built from thousands of repetitions in the Kill House training facility at Hereford. He could assess a compound layout from aerial imagery and walk through the physical space in real time with a degree of orientation that his conventional army counterparts would have described, when they discussed it at all, as almost supernatural. He was not supernatural. He was trained. At 02:14 hours, on the 9th of August 2009, 4 modified Chinook helicopters departed their launch point and crossed 62 kilometers of Helmand terrain at low level, below radar coverage, following the dried riverbeds and irrigation canals that the crews had memorized from repeated rehearsals in the preceding weeks. The helicopters were equipped with forward-looking infrared systems that rendered the landscape in shades of grey and white, and the faint heat signatures of sleeping animals and cooking fires still warm in the compounds below. The approach took 11 minutes. The helicopters went to ground level. They did not land, they hovered. The men came off the ramp. They were carrying approximately 38 kilograms each. This included a Heckler and Koch 416 assault rifle, with a 10-inch barrel variant chambered in 5.56mm, a Sig Sauer P2226 sidearm, 4 fragmentation grenades, 2 stun grenades, a Pelter headset communication system, a personal roll radio, a night vision monocular system capable of amplifying ambient light by 40,000 times, a medical kit containing 2 tourniquets, a hemostatic dressing, a chest seal, and a cricothyroidotomy kit. Body armor rated to stop a 7.62mm round, a Camelback hydration system, extra magazines bringing total ammunition load to approximately 300 rounds, and a physical fitness level maintained by mandatory physical training 6 days per week. That meant this weight, while significant, was within their operational parameters. They covered 400 meters to the compound wall in under 3 minutes. In the same time, a recreational runner in good condition might cover 600 meters on a flat track. These men covered 400 meters across broken, featureless desert terrain in darkness, in full combat load, in silence. The compound wall was 2.4 meters high. They were over it in seconds. What happened inside that compound took 4 minutes and 20 seconds from breach to clear. 1 facilitator was killed. 1 was captured alive. 4 women and 6 children, sleeping in a separate structure, were not harmed. The intelligence materials recovered from the compound, including communications equipment, a laptop, and a quantity of documents written in Pashto and Arabic, were catalogued, bagged, and extracted. The intelligence analysts would later assess this single operation as having disrupted a financial network that had been funding between 8 and 12 improvised explosive device attacks per month in central Helmand. The helicopters were inbound before the surrounding compounds had fully processed what had happened. The dust cloud from the rotors was still settling when the element was airborne. The operation took 37 minutes from launch to recovery. 37 minutes. The internal inquiry into the Welsh Guards' ambush the previous afternoon would take 18 months. The after-action reports from Task Force night operations in Afghanistan during this period were classified at a level above that routinely accessible to conventional British commanders. This was not, as some officers privately complained, entirely about operational security. It was also about institutional comfort. Because the operational data from Special Forces night raids during Operation Herrick tells a story that the conventional British Army's chain of command found genuinely difficult to contextualize. Between 2006 and 2014, Task Force Night and its predecessor formations conducted what is assessed by open-source analysis of Ministry of Defense statements, American congressional records, and parliamentary questions to have been in the region of 1,800 to 2,200 discrete direct action operations across Afghanistan. The precise figure remains classified. What is not classified is the Joint Committee on Human Rights examination of this period, which noted in its 2014 report that the tempo of Special Forces operations in Afghanistan had exceeded that of any previous British military campaign in the modern era, including the Falklands. What this means in operational terms is that the Special Air Service and its associated Special Forces units were, during the height of operations in Helmand, conducting raids on an almost nightly basis, not every week, not several times a month, every night, night after night after night, rotating through targeting packages developed jointly with American intelligence agencies and British signals intelligence from Government Communications Headquarters in Cheltenham, learning the patterns of Taliban command networks with an intimacy that no amount of daytime patrolling or cultural engagement could produce. The Taliban learned to recognize patterns. They learned that certain operations happened at night. They learned that the helicopters were quiet and came low, and that by the time you heard them, the men were already moving. They began building their own operational security around the rhythm of these raids, spreading their communication times, reducing their gatherings, maintaining smaller cell sizes. The internal pressure this created in Taliban command structures is documented in captured communications analyzed by the Defense Intelligence Staff, and somewhere in the provincial Taliban communications networks, the name appeared: Shaitan Arba, the Night Devils, not the British Army, not the foreign soldiers, the specific team, or perhaps the specific spirit, that came without warning, without daylight, without the preparation time that conventional military operations always inadvertently provided. The Taliban field commander whose radio intercept first produced this phrase, according to a source cited in the International Institute for Strategic Studies report on British Special Forces operations, published in 2017, was not speaking metaphorically. He was reporting to his superior that there were forces operating in Helmand whose presence could not be detected until contact was made, at which point it was too late to react. He used the word shaitan, meaning devil or adversary in a spiritual sense, as a category of enemy that operated outside normal human limitations. He used it the way you use it for something you cannot explain. This was not hyperbole from a frightened man. This was a military assessment from a commander trying to explain to his chain of command why his best fighters were not surviving contact, and then the bureaucracy intervened. In the spring of 2010, a policy review conducted at the level of the Permanent Joint Headquarters at Northwood began examining the operational structure of Task Force Night in Afghanistan. The review was prompted not by any operational failure, it was prompted by the success. Specifically by the political sensitivity of that success, because the accumulated intelligence picture from 2 years of nightly raids was beginning to produce something that neither the Ministry of Defense nor the Foreign and Commonwealth Office had planned for: a granular, actionable map of Taliban financial and command networks that extended well beyond Helmand into Quetta in Pakistan, and into Gulf state funding channels that touched on diplomatic relationships the Foreign Office was actively managing. The review produced a recommendation, later described by a Special Forces officer in testimony to the Intelligence and Security Committee as operational guidance, that certain categories of intelligence exploitation be channeled through a joint review process before action was taken. In practical terms, this meant that targeting packages derived from the most sensitive intelligence streams would require approval from a committee that met twice a week on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Twice a week. The Taliban did not take Tuesdays and Thursdays off. The Special Forces community's response to this guidance was documented in the Intelligence and Security Committee's 2013 report, which noted, in language of extraordinary diplomatic restraint, that there had been significant friction between Special Forces Command and the policy-level review process during certain periods of Operation Herrick, and that this friction had, on occasion, affected operational tempo. What this means in plain language is that men who had spent their careers developing the ability to act on intelligence within hours of its production were being asked to wait for a committee meeting, that compounds that were hot at midnight were cold by Thursday afternoon, that networks that had taken months of surveillance to map were warned by the operational pause that something was about to happen. One senior Special Forces commander, referred to only as a serving officer of field rank in the ISC report, used language so restrained it could only have been chosen with great care. He said, "We operate in a perishable intelligence environment. Delay is not a neutral act. Delay is not a neutral act." A phrase quoted in 3 subsequent academic analyses of British Special Forces doctrine, because it captures in 6 words the entire doctrinal argument about the relationship between intelligence, time, and outcome. The committee met on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The night devils waited. What does it mean, at a structural level, that a unit can operate with this efficiency? And why can conventional forces not simply replicate it? This question was addressed most directly by the Army's own internal study of the Helmand campaign, conducted between 2012 and 2014, whose conclusions were summarized in a document called Operation Herrick Campaign Study, released in redacted form in 2015. The campaign study identified, with a bluntness unusual in military self-assessment, that the British Army had entered Afghanistan without a clearly defined campaign plan, without adequate resources relative to its stated objectives, and without a coherent doctrine for the type of warfare it encountered. This is not a criticism invented after the fact. Lieutenant Colonel Tutal, whose paratroopers were the first to absorb the full weight of the Taliban's 2006 offensive, wrote about these structural failures in his 2009 book Danger Close, written after leaving the Army, a book that the Ministry of Defense attempted to have reviewed before publication. Tutal described being told by senior officers before deployment that Helmand would be a reconstruction mission, a development mission, a mission in which the paratroopers would spend their time building schools. He described the gap between this institutional narrative and the reality of daily firefights with an anger that 17 years of military discipline had made very precise. The Special Forces community's ability to operate differently stems from a different institutional relationship with the truth. Because selection filters not just for physical and psychological endurance, but for a specific cognitive quality: the ability to make accurate assessments under pressure without reference to institutional comfort. The candidate on the Brecon Beacons at 2 a.m, carrying 25 kilograms in horizontal rain with 6 hours still to go, is not being tested primarily for fitness. Fitness is a prerequisite, not a selection criterion. What is being tested is whether, at the point of complete physical and psychological exhaustion, the candidate's perception of reality remains accurate, whether they know where they are, whether they know what they have to do, whether they can continue doing it without someone telling them to. This matters because the defining feature of the intelligence-driven night raid as a tactical instrument is that everything happens in compressed time with incomplete information, in conditions that degrade human performance. The question is not whether you can perform under these conditions. The question is how far your performance degrades. And the answer, for an operator with 17 years of Special Forces experience and 4 combat deployments, is not very far. The conventional forces casualties in Helmand were not, in the main, the result of tactical incompetence. The soldiers who died were, in almost every case, doing what they had been told to do, in the manner they had been trained to do it. The failures were structural. The patrol routes were predictable, because the operational planning process required them to be logged and coordinated through channels that took time and created signatures. The intelligence assessments that informed these patrols were produced by a system designed for set-piece warfare in Central Europe, not for the dynamic cellular threat of a Taliban district network. The vehicles were heavy and loud because they were designed to survive blast rather than avoid it. The Special Forces approach inverted this logic. You do not survive the blast. You make contact on your terms, in darkness at a time and place of your choosing, and you end the contact before the enemy's response has time to organize. The vehicle you are driving is a helicopter. The armor you rely on is not ceramic plate, but the 37 minutes from launch to recovery that leave no time for the enemy to react. In 2010, the year the bureaucratic review slowed targeting, improvised explosive device attacks in Helmand increased by approximately 30%. This correlation was noted by Special Forces intelligence analysts at the time. It was not prominently featured in the Ministry of Defense's public communications. There is a second story that runs parallel to the main one and must be told, because without it, the pattern looks like a single incident rather than a doctrine. In 2007, 18 months before the events described above, a different kind of failure occurred in the same province. A company of soldiers from the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, operating in the Musa Qala district under intense Taliban pressure, was effectively pinned inside a district center for 9 days following a series of coordinated Taliban attacks that cut off their resupply routes by road. The soldiers were running low on water, food, and ammunition. The helicopter assets available to the British task force in theatre were insufficient to sustain the company at the required rate while simultaneously supporting operations in 4 other districts across Helmand. The request for Special Forces assistance with the resupply and with the direct action operations that might have broken the Taliban cordon was submitted through the proper channels. The proper channels required the request to go from the company commander to the battle group commander to the combined Joint Task Force headquarters at Kandahar Airfield, where it would be reviewed against other priorities by a committee including American liaison officers who had their own Special Operations Force priorities in the same theater. The process took 72 hours. The Fusiliers had been requesting emergency assistance for 48 of those hours. The Special Forces element that eventually responded did so with a speed and effectiveness that the Fusiliers' own after-action report described, with characteristic British understatement, as impressive. One sergeant major from the Fusiliers, 29 years old at the time and now a civilian, was quoted in an academic study of the Helmand campaign, published by the Royal United Services Institute in 2016. He said, with the direct simplicity of someone who had spent 9 days not eating enough, "They came in like a different species. They came in like a different species." That quote was not selected as the summary observation of a complex campaign by chance. It was selected because it names with the accuracy of direct experience the fundamental truth of what the institutional contrast in Helmand produced when observed from the inside. Consider the mathematics of the selection process across 1 decade. Between 2001 and 2014, the British Army deployed approximately 140,000 individual soldiers to Afghanistan across multiple rotations. Of these, 454 died. Thousands were wounded, many severely. The financial cost of the British military effort in Afghanistan is assessed at approximately £20.3 billion over the 13 years of operation. In the same period, the Special Air Service and supporting Special Forces units conducted, at minimum, several hundred direct action operations per year in Afghanistan, working from a manpower pool of, at any given time, 2 to 3 Sabre squadrons rotated through theatre, comprising between 120 and 180 operators at the operational level. These operators were supported by a signals intelligence apparatus, a targeting cell, an aviation element, and a joint intelligence and surveillance architecture that was, in relative terms, the most expensive per-operator intelligence support in British military history. The return on that investment, measured in disrupted Taliban networks, captured commanders, and the intelligence exploitation that followed each operation, is described in the still partially classified Joint Intelligence Committee assessment of Task Force Knight's contribution to the Helmand campaign. What is publicly known from parliamentary testimony and the partial declassification of the Herrick campaign study is that the Special Forces' contribution to degrading Taliban command capacity in Helmand was assessed by the Permanent Joint Headquarters as disproportionate to their size by a factor that no official document has been willing to quantify precisely, but which multiple retired officers have described, in publications and interviews, as somewhere between 5 and 10 to 1, 5 operators doing the work of 50. Not because they were braver, not because they were reckless, because they had been built, over years, to operate in conditions that rendered most of the conventional forces' tactical approach irrelevant. The Taliban called them night devils, because they could not understand, within their framework of military logic, how men could appear from darkness, complete their mission, and disappear before the alarm had time to form a coherent response. They reached for a spiritual explanation because the tactical one did not fit. What they were observing was not magic, it was selection. It was training. It was the 17-year staff sergeant who spoke Pashto, and had cleared 1,000 rooms before this one, operating in an environment that his preparation had made, in relative terms, less extreme than the Brecon beacons in January. The Ministry of Defence's official statements throughout this period described Special Forces operations in terms so general as to be meaningless. A typical formulation, repeated across dozens of parliamentary questions and public statements, ran, "Special Forces conduct operations in Afghanistan in support of the wider campaign. Their specific activities cannot be commented on for security reasons." The Ministry of Defense notes the professionalism and dedication of all personnel serving in Afghanistan. Professionalism and dedication. The gap between that formulation and the reality of a 4-minute compound clearance at 2 in the morning, executed by men who had been doing this specific thing for the better part of 2 decades, is not a small gap. It is the gap between institutional language and operational truth, and it exists because institutional language is not designed to convey operational truth. It is designed to manage it. In the years since the British withdrawal from Helmand in 2014, the conversation about what worked and what did not has moved, cautiously and incompletely, into the public domain. Tootle's book was followed by others. The partial release of the Herrick campaign study produced a moment of institutional honesty rare in British military history. The Royal United Services Institute's series of analyses on the Afghanistan campaign, the work of scholars including Theo Farrell and Stuart Gordon, began to assemble a picture of the structural failures that cost 454 lives. The Special Forces dimension of this conversation remains, for the most part, in the shadows where it has always operated. Not because the conversations are not happening, but because the institution that conducted those operations has a philosophical relationship with silence that predates the Afghan campaign by decades. The Special Air Service does not hold parades. It does not hold press conferences. Its operators do not appear on the television programs that its conventional army counterparts sometimes consent to. The regimental motto, "Who dares wins," is famous because other people say it. The regiment itself says almost nothing. This silence is not performance, it is doctrine, because the operational value of the Night Devils rested in large part on the Taliban's uncertainty about exactly who and what they were dealing with. Certainty is intelligence. Intelligence is advantage. The regiment's silence denied its enemies certainty, and thereby denied them advantage. The soldiers who came in like a different species over the mountains of Helmand in the small hours of countless mornings between 2006 and 2014 are, for the most part, still anonymous. Some are still serving. Some have retired to lives that bear no visible trace of what they did. The staff sergeant, now past 50, does not appear in any public record. The operations he conducted will not be fully declassified within his lifetime. The Taliban fighter who first used the words Shaitan Aba is dead. The network he was reporting on when he said those words was disrupted within months of that intercept. The compound where that conversation took place is a ruin. What remains is the lesson. And the lesson is not comfortable for institutions that have built their doctrine around firepower and technology and the assumption that the side with more equipment wins. Because Helmand proved, again, what every asymmetric conflict since Malaya has proved, that extreme conditions do not favor the side with the most sophisticated technology. They favor the side that has built human beings capable of functioning with terrifying competence when the technology fails, when the communications break, when the plan dissolves, when the darkness is absolute and the enemy is awake and the helicopter is 11 minutes away and all you have is what you have trained yourself to be. The Taliban called them Night Devils, because the alternative was admitting that 41-year-old sergeants from Hereford had simply trained harder, suffered longer, and prepared more honestly for the precise conditions that broke everyone else. That is not a supernatural explanation. That is a doctrinal one. Technology does not win wars in the dark. Prepared human beings do. It has always been true. It will always be true. The only question is which institution is willing to pay the cost of building them.